Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. I'm sure you will find today's discussion both entertaining and interesting. Today's guest, Fred Foldvary, is a lecturer in economics at San Jose State University and a research fellow at the Independent Institute. He also serves as a commentator and senior editor for the online journal The Progress Report and as an associate editor of the online journal Econ Journal Watch. Professor Foldvary earned his PhD in economics from George Mason University, where his dissertation examined the application of the theory of public goods and industrial organization, refuting the concept of market failure. He is a leading spokesperson of the geo-libertarian perspective on the appropriate balance between rights to property, civil liberties, and free markets. He has authored 6 books, including in 2007, The Depression of 2008. Smart Talk viewers may remember that Fred Foldvary appeared on this program in 2014 when he discussed with Andrew Mazzoni the basis for his prediction of the 2008 financial crisis. If Thomas Paine would observe today our political and economic circumstances, he might agree that the times that tried men's souls have never really ended. In these times of divisive ideologies, positioning for political power, Fred Foldvary has provided food for thought in an essay titled Economics for Progressives. Smart Talk invited Fred to join us to elaborate on the arguments made in this essay. I'll start off by asking Fred to expand on his challenge to progressives to study economics in order to gain, quote, the understanding of the implicit reality beneath superficial appearances. Fred, welcome to Smart Talk. Fred, I'd like to start off by asking you to expand on your challenge to progressives to study economics in order to gain what you said was the understanding of the implicit reality beneath superficial appearances. So what do you mean by that? And what do you think it is that progressives aren't seeing that they need to see?
Okay. Well, economics uses the word real to differentiate from conventional or accounting or ordinary things. For example, real interest in contrast to nominal interest. So suppose you have a financial account and you have 5% interest. So that's the nominal interest. That's what's stated, and that's the money you get. But an economist looks beneath that, recognizing that inflation reduces the actual gain. Some of the 5% is just to make up for rising prices. So say inflation is 3%, you subtract the 3% inflation from the 5% nominal rate, and then you get the real interest of 2%. Same thing with profit. We distinguish accounting profit from economic profit. So suppose somebody has a business and they say, well, I have a profit of $200,000 according to my accountant, right? But an economist looks beneath that. What's the real gain? Because if you didn't own a business, you would be earning a wage someplace else. So suppose the wage was $80,000, and suppose you have your own assets in your business, and if you sold it, you could get a return on those of, say, $30,000. So you subtract the opportunity cost, the wage you could have gotten, and what your assets would have earned you, right? And what's left is what economists would call the economic profit. So it's not the 200,000 accounting profit, but the 90,000 economic profit after you subtracted the implicit costs. So much of what goes on in the economy is implicit. It's not a number that's visible or obvious. It's not something you pay somebody else, but nevertheless, it's a real cost or a real gain. And so you learn economics to understand the difference between economic profit and accounting profit, or real interest versus nominal interest. And that goes out throughout the economy. Now, with respect to rent, rent is implicit because suppose you own a house and you rent it out to somebody, right? So that's explicit. A tenant is paying you rent. But if it's owner occupied, it's the same housing service, right? So there's an implicit rent. In effect, you as tenant are paying yourself a rent as landlord, even though money doesn't change hands. So that's an implicit reality. So that's an example of going beneath the superficial appearance to uncover the implicit reality.
Well, you've raised several really important points in just that short few statements. I mean, let's start with real versus nominal interest rates. A related issue is how does statisticians determine the appropriate base year on which to begin? I mean, it seems to me that it's rather subjective.
Well, the base year is not that important because everything is relative to the base year. So suppose the base year was 2010, and in 2011 there was 5% inflation. So the base year would have an index of 1 and then you'd go to 1.05. But if the base year was the previous year, right, you'd still have a 5% inflation during, 2010 to 11. So the index number would be different, but the adjusting for inflation would be the same.
Well, let's take that a step deeper then. When you look at income distribution, if your nominal income is increasing faster than the rate of inflation, then you are keeping pace or you're doing better than the loss of purchasing power of your currency, your currency values.
That's right, you have real gain. Yeah.
But in our society, we see that a significant percentage of employed people are way behind. In other words, their nominal income has not kept pace with the rate of inflation over the years. And so they're very much behind in terms of their purchasing power. Now, how do economists explain that in terms of effects on the long-term prospects for the economy?
Yeah, economists look at your real income adjusted for inflation, and so inflation is going along higher than your income increase. Yeah, then your real income has gone down, and that's well recognized in economics. So the real wage, for example, is the nominal wage, which you're paid in money, divided by the price level. So if the price level is going up and your nominal wage is not, your real wage is going down.
Okay. Now with regard to this distinction in between economic profit and accounting profit, my background is in accounting. And so I've always thought that when economists use the term profit, it's really not really an appropriate economic term, because in my mind, profit is simply revenue less expenses. What is left over is your profit. But if you look at it from an economics perspective, that profit can be derived from any combination of rent, wages, and returns to capital. So it seems to me that the economics discipline hasn't done a very good service for public understanding of what comprises profit.
Well, a profit can be a return to any factor. It can be a return to labor, land, or capital goods. So, but the economic profit is you have to, after subtracting out all the explicit and implicit costs. So I think economics does explain profit somewhat. What is not so much explained in texts about profit is when that profit is really theft. If somebody breaks into your house and steals something and then sells it, right, that robber has a gain, right? But it would not be what economists understand as profit, which is from voluntary transactions. So yeah, profit is a complex thing.
Well, in our economy right now, there the analysis of our economy by economists at different ends of the ideological perspective has led to proposals for very dramatically different policy options. And in your paper, you present what you believe you see as the appropriate policy options in a number of different areas of our economy: the environment, healthcare, the idea of a universal basic income, etc. I know you're strongly influenced by your study of the Austrian economists, as well as by your study of Henry George and his works.
Yes.
Where does that position you within the economics discipline, and how does that affect the writing that you do when you and the audience that you're addressing, if your audience is economists largely trained in the neoclassical school?
Yes, the neoclassical school has not had a good theory of capital goods. And that's where the Austrian theory is superior, because the neoclassical school is largely mathematical in advanced studies. And so they just homogenize capital into one variable, K. Whereas the Austrian school differentiates capital goods according to their duration. So goods of quick duration, right, are not sensitive to the interest rate because you're only going to borrow the money for a short time. Goods of long duration, like real estate, right, are more sensitive to the interest rate. So there's a structure of capital goods recognized by the Austrian school. And that's quite important for the theory of the business cycle. But what the Austrian school has lacked is a good theory of land and its rent. And that's where the Georgists fit in. So I see Georgism and Austrian economics as complementary. The Austrians supplying a good theory of interest, the interest rate and capital goods, and the Georgists supplying a theory of land and rent. Both of these are needed in order to understand, for example, the business cycle.
Now, what is the reception that you get when you make this argument to fellow Austrians?
They really haven't argued against it. They don't understand how important that is to include land and rent. There was one article, not really by an Austrian, by a neoclassical economist, who tried to argue against land value taxation because he says that it does not take into account the work done in exploring land and seeking out the best location and so on. And if the rent is all taxed away, the entrepreneur would not get compensated for his effort. Before you start building, you have to search for sites and so on. Well, I replied to that saying that that searching is really labor and would not be taxed. And so, yes, just if you look at what a plot would rent for, that rental would include returns to capital goods as well as land and labor. After all, if you have an apartment, the manager or landlord provides some labor services. So conceptually, that criticism was wrong. So there are Austrians who basically have a more ideological stance. So they're not really making an economic case, they're just ideological. So they're not really Austrian economics in that sense. But there was in the literature of Austrian economics, there's a volume called about space, the spatial aspects of Austrian economics. And so I wrote a chapter on that, on land. And that's a part of the Austrian literature. And so there have been Austrians that understood George, such as Leland Jaeger, a monetary economist. But most of them, it's not that they're opposed to it, they just don't fully grasp it.
Well, at the other end of the ideological spectrum, on the left, are economists such as Richard Wolff. I don't know if you've paid much attention to what he's been doing in the last few years, but since he retired from his faculty position at the University of Massachusetts, he's been teaching at the New School in New York, and he says in interviews, in his lectures, he says, look, I taught neoclassical economics for 40 some years, and in the classroom it was almost impossible to even bring up any kind of alternative economic theories. He said you'd never have heard the words Henry George or Karl Marx mentioned in those classes. And so now he's really taking it upon himself to sell his version of socialism based on worker cooperatives and industrial democracy. And I wonder how you see this ideological shift to a degree in our own country, where a large percentage of individuals are moving to the left and beginning to embrace some degree of socialist programs as a part of the basic need for reform, and whether or not the sort of modified form of socialism that Wolff is proposing makes sense to you in any way.
Well, part of the problem is the word capitalism, because people say the United States has a capitalist economy, but people also use the word capitalism as a term for the free market, right? So we have a mixed economy, a mixture of government and markets, and so the word capitalism gets confused, with whether it's in one meaning it's free market, and the other meaning it's the current mixed economy with government intervention. People have become disillusioned with the current system, which they think of as a market system because people use the word capitalism. But and certainly our system has a lot of problems. We have poverty, we have pollution, right? And so people, since these problems aren't really being solved very well, people blame the market, not really investigating whether it's really government intervention that caused these problems. So the disillusion is because people confuse what we have today with a largely market economy, and therefore they think the market failed. Whereas if you trace problems like unemployment, poverty, and so on, you can see that the government has made things worse, right? Has caused a lot of these problems. Our tax system, for example, penalizes entrepreneurship and growth and productivity by taxing labor and taxing, private enterprise. Whereas if the tax were on land instead, right, then you'd have more growth, more employment, higher wages. But as I said, it needs an understanding of economics to see that the implicit reality of what's going on. So
well, that sounds almost directly out of Henry George for sure.
Yeah. That's why in economics for progressives, I ask people to think of analyze the cause of problems rather than just applying remedies that seem superficially good, like minimum wages.
Well, the other school of modern criticism of economic theory and economic policies, both that in the mainstream left and right, is coming from those economists who have embraced modern monetary theory and advocates for such measures as public banks, such as Ellen Brown and Stephen Keen and others, Michael Hudson. I've done some battle with them over one particular assertion that is made in their writings and in their addresses, and that is that individual commercial banks create new money every time they make a loan. And I've tried to explain to them why I believe this is impossible with no success whatsoever. And I fully accept the problem being one of the central banks. Certainly, the Federal Reserve System, by creating monetary digital money out of thin air, lending it to the federal government at interest, is certainly not doing the public any service and has bailed out many entities that should have perhaps failed.
Yeah.
Where are we headed with this monetary system that we have in place, Fred? If the public debt in the United States continues to escalate as it is, and our Congress has no commitment to even try to reduce not just the deficit, but forget about the public debt, when is the day of reckoning coming?
The day of reckoning will come in a severe financial crisis similar to what we had in 2008 and 9. Because until the financial crisis, the credit of the United States is still good. U.S. government can still borrow money. By the way, this modern monetary theory claims that when government takes in tax money, they're reducing the money supply, right? The government, they want the Treasury Department to issue money for spending, and then they say, but when government taxes, they remove money from the economy. Well, that's really, I don't see it that way, because when a government taxes people, that's just the transfer of funds from the private accounts to the government's accounts, right? The government has financial accounts, and then from that they spend it. So I think modern monetary theory is fundamentally misunderstands the role of taxation. But I totally agree with you that not just the official debt, which is something like $21 trillion now, and growing at $1 trillion a year, and Republicans that used to be conservative in their budget now spend just as freely as anybody else. So, and also, of course, the unfunded liabilities, what we owe people in the future for Medicare, which we are not collecting in taxes. So there's a trust fund, that's going to get depleted for Medicare and Medicaid. But so the crisis will come in the next severe recession, like in 2008. There'll be another financial crisis and another collapse of, asset values, real estate and stocks. And at that time, the government debt will be so much bigger that possibly U.S. Treasury bonds will no longer be seen as risk-free, because they'll have to borrow money not just to bail everything out, but also to pay the interest. And so when government debt, people will be afraid the government can't even pay the interest in the future. Then government debt will be risky and be that much. There'll be that much more that they'll have to pay for the debt service. So. I see this coming to a crunch in the next financial crisis, or maybe the one after that. I've written about the real estate cycle of average of 18 years. And if we add 18 years to the Depression of 2008, we get to 2026. So if the real estate cycle continues, and so far it has, right, I foresee a major crisis around 2026.
Yeah, I hear very few commentators expressing any concern whatsoever on the fact that median residential property prices in the major metropolitan areas across the country are now well above their peaks of 2007.
That's right.
And the question that it raises in my mind is, where are households who are renters going to get the savings and income to qualify to become homeowners? And if interest rates go up, that's going to mean it's going to be more difficult for people to qualify for mortgage financing unless the regulators back off and we see another rise in the subprime mortgage loan market. That really, in my mind, was the trigger to the 2008 collapse. Yeah,
I agree. we can already see this in California, where real estate prices are very high, and ordinary people with ordinary income just can't afford a house, and then they have to live far away and commute a long distance to be able to live someplace.
The last statistic I saw was that there are about 100 large tent cities scattered around the country outside of the main downtown areas of our large cities. I don't know if there are any in San Jose, but it's amazing how many people are living in these kinds of situations, and certainly not all of them are have mental health or drug problems. A large number of them are people just who are down on their luck economically.
Yeah, we see this in the San Francisco Bay Area as well as Los Angeles and other places.
Well, you and I, years ago in Edinburgh, we discussed the whole issue of where should the regulation fall with regard to banks. And at that time, you expressed a strong position that we should allow banks to issue their own banknotes.
Yes.
And the argument that you made, I thought, was similar to the argument that was made by the banks in the 1800s, and that is, the further away you get from the origin of the bank's banknotes, the more discounted those notes will become, and so the market will, in effect, price the notes appropriately based on the risk. And I wonder if you still think that moving to a decentralized system of currency issuance would in fact be more stable than what we have grown to have in terms of the globalization of finance.
It would be more stable. That system of banks issuing their own currency in a market environment is called free banking.
Right.
Which is not to be confused with the so-called free banking of the United States before the Civil War, which was not really free market banking. The United States has never had free banking or free market banking. So the way it would work is that there would be a real money that would be outside the banks, as gold used to operate outside the banks. The amount of gold depends on mining and not on creation by banks. So there'd be real money, and then the bank notes would be money substitutes convertible into the real money, and that would keep the value of the banknote stable, and also the ability to convert the money substitutes, the banknotes, into real money would limit excessive creation, because if the banks inflated their banknotes, these notes would come right back to the banks for redemption into real money. And so a free banking system with real money and money substitutes would provide both stability and flexibility. So if the demand to hold money increased, the banks could increase their money substitutes. And so that's not the way the U.S. operated, prior to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. It's never been like that. But there have been a few places that did implement that, so you can look at the history. And Scotland is a prime example. They had relatively free banking until 1844, when they went under the Bank of England. And so there were a few large banks, well known, and people accepted their notes issued by those banks. The banks worked together, kind of like as a lender of last resort. They could borrow from one another, kind of like they borrow from the Federal Reserve today. And so you can see both the theory and practice of free banking, and the practice. And Canada had relatively a free banking system until the Great Depression, and they did not have the bank crisis that the United States did. So that's the theory, and there's evidence that it can work well.
Is the potential for that system dependent upon the backing of the money, the money substitute by gold and silver, or is there?
Yeah, if we were to switch from central banking to free banking today, then the real money would no longer be gold because people are no longer used to having gold. We're used to dealing in US dollars. So what George Selgin, one of the Austrian theorists of free banking, says is that if we were to convert to free banking, we would freeze the amount of Federal Reserve notes. The paper currency would be frozen, and that would serve as real money, right? And then the private bank notes, like Bank of America dollar or Wells Fargo dollar, they could be converted into the Federal Reserve notes whenever people wanted to. And so this would be the way free banking could be implemented today.
That's an interesting concept. I'll have to give that a good deal more thought.
Yeah.
My instincts are still to go back to what the Bank of Amsterdam, the Bank of Amsterdam operated in the 1600s as a deposit bank. I still think that an international system of deposit banks would have some merit. And one way you could establish an international currency would be to for the countries to enter into a treaty where they all agreed to mint coinage that had the same metallic content. Mm-hmm. That would back their currency, their paper currency in circulation or whatever digital currency. But that would eliminate the problem of floating exchange rates, and at least by those countries that participated in that kind of a treaty. This is certainly something that people are paying more and more attention to because of the volatility and instability of the international financial system. And many of the critics point to the abandonment of the measures instituted after Bretton Woods, and particularly when Richard Nixon took the United States off of the gold standard. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question I would have to you is there a reasonable way to put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, first of all, before World War I, when many countries were on a gold standard, we did not have currency fluctuations, right? Because the dollar and the British pound and the German mark and so on, each had a fixed relationship to gold and therefore a fixed relationship to one another. Today, I think if several countries converted to free banking, then I think the market would create banks that use gold, and if several banks did that, then I think the market would move towards an international system. And it would probably be based on gold because of the qualities of gold and its historic usage. So I think that's the way it would work. You would have countries converting to free banking, then you'd have banks that would choose to use gold instead of national currency, and the advantage would be that they would have, if a lot of banks did that, you would eliminate the currency fluctuations that you have with national currency. So I think the market could move toward pretty much what you had in mind.
Would it be possible, I guess the way to best describe it, to invoke Gresham's law in reverse, to have good money chasing out bad money if, for example, the Asian nations led by China and Japan moved in that independent direction that you're talking about, in a way that the U.S. dollar would then become a much less desired asset to hold simply because it's been the global currency,
right?
Reserve currency.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, Gresham's law applied when you had two or more currencies where the values were fixed by the government instead of being based on supply and demand. Then the bad money drives out the good money because people don't want.
Right.
So, but yeah, the reverse would happen. I think so.
Let's move on to one of the issues that you wrote about in your essay that I think has sparked a tremendous political discussion without a great deal of substantive analysis, and that is this whole idea of giving everyone a universal basic income, whether
Yes.
it's $1,000 a month or whatever the amount might be.
Yeah.
The one question, of course, is how should it be paid for? How could it be paid for? And the second question is, what would the ramifications be of adding this kind of income to everyone's monthly income? And my particular concern, and I've raised this, in my teaching and in other, whenever I've had the opportunity, is the effect on residential property prices and
Right.
rents for apartments.
That's right.
I don't think the general public, and perhaps some economists don't understand how this would potentially be capitalized into higher, rents to landlords.
Exactly. Right. And a proposal to have universal basic income from a higher income tax or a value-added tax would first of all create a deadweight loss, a drag on the economy. And secondly, as you said, if a neighborhood is now receiving higher monthly incomes, right, the landlords would see that as an opportunity to increase the rent, or people would bid up the price of real estate as they now have higher incomes. So much of the gains from UBI would be captured by higher land rent and land values. Exactly. And that's why UBI, if it exists, should be funded from land rent in the first place. And then if the rent goes up, it goes right back to the people.
I guess the pushback that I sometimes get in this discussion is, well, Ed, leases don't all expire at the same time, so you have millions of people that would get the income, and they would still be under terms of their lease for another year or 2 years before any increase might hit them, and then the market's going to respond by increasing the supply of new housing. And in my response to them is, well, that may be true, but it also means that the owners of vacant land, when they're negotiating with the developer, are going to ask for a higher selling price for the land they own, because they know that the people who are going to end up either living in the apartments could pay more, or if they're going to be buying the units, they can afford to borrow more.
Yes. And now in California, prices of real estate are especially higher than much of the rest of the country, because of restrictions on new housing. Zoning laws and other restrictions on development have limited the supply of new housing, so that as the jobs have grown faster than housing. And also, besides that, there are impact fees, or actually taxes, on developers, which greatly increase the cost of providing a new house. And if that were funded from land value taxation, then you would not have this artificial increase in housing costs. In fact, with land value taxation, right, the price of land would drop and housing would be more affordable. So you'd have a shift from taxing labor to taxing land value would make wages higher and housing costs lower, which would eliminate that huge discrepancy we now see between wages and housing costs.
With all of the challenges that Californians are facing, is it still political suicide to call for an end to Prop 13?
Unfortunately, it is, because you have a powerful lobby, well organized, that fights it every time. And so you have to kind of go incrementally. There's proposals to assess commercial real estate annually, because by Proposition 13, that was passed in 1978, the real estate tax is based on the price when purchased, increasing by no more than 2% a year thereafter. So if commercial real estate turns over more slowly. So at least if commercial real estate were assessed every year, even if the tax remains at 1%, you would have a much greater portion of property taxes from commercial properties. And, so there's incremental changes we can make. Many local governments have actually gone around Proposition 13 with other property-based levies, such as a parcel tax. A parcel tax is a tax on real estate not based on the value, but based on the size of the lot or maybe a equal payment per parcel. And there's been other kinds of taxes that have gone around Proposition 13 so that, but it just makes everything more complex and more difficult.
Do you have any sense of the percentage of land in California that is tax exempt? You know, for example, owned by major universities and other nonprofits?
Yeah, I don't know the percentage, but it is in the California Constitution that nonprofit organizations like schools and churches do not pay a property tax. So in effect, they're subsidized.
Yeah. Well, I suspect that if you did a calculation of the potential rent fund that could be collected and then compared that with the actual amount of revenue collected from real estate taxation, that there'd be some multiple more revenue that should be coming into state coffers or into the coffers of local government.
I agree, yeah.
But is anyone, publishing those kinds of figures to give people something to really chew on in terms of fighting for changes in the law?
I haven't seen any such studies, but they would be needed.
Maybe that's something that you ought to think about, Fred,
Sure.
as you're
Okay.
looking around for some research projects for your students.
Yes.
So let me ask you then. I'm teaching senior adults. Everyone is 60 years old and older, and they bring a real perspective of their life experience into the classroom. And when I discuss how the economy really works, they're getting it, and they've experienced the booms and the busts. How about young people? They're facing serious challenges. They have fairly high college debt if they graduate from college. Their prospects are perceived to be less than the prospects were for you and I when we were their age. What kind of dialogue occurs in your classroom over when you get into a discussion of economic policy and the impacts of policies on their lives?
Well, I've had no problem discussing tax reform in my class. When I teach public finance, then these topics come up. But also when I teach, for example, microeconomics, part of the subject matter is the deadweight loss of taxation.
Right.
And so, there's always an opportunity to bring that in. And so I point out that if there were no taxes on labor, both on the employee and the employer, you would have more opportunity to work and a higher wage. There'd be more employment and higher wages. And people could then work part-time more and avoid, borrowing so much for student debt. Another thing, when we talk about minimum wages, I point out that another way to increase the wages of the poor, as I pointed out also in the essay I wrote on Economics for Progressives, an alternative to higher minimum wages is a higher earned income tax credit, which would tax the entire economy and not specifically the employers of low-skilled workers. So I think the students, I think they understand these kinds of things.
Are the majority of your students economics majors?
They're business majors.
Business majors.
So yeah, the business school is separate. The Department of Economics at San Jose State University is in the College of Art of Science, Social Science, but we get students from the College of Business who are required to take economics courses. So I'd say the majority are business majors taking their required economics principles.
That was exactly what was required of me when I was an undergraduate in the business school. I had, macro and microeconomics, and some years later, I wrote probably my first paper that discussed my conversion to Henry George's ideas. And I titled it From Samuelson to George at Galbraithian bypass.
That's good. Yeah. I think Samuelson, in his economics textbook, long time ago, did include a discussion of taxing land in relationship to having no deadweight loss. That's my recollection.
You would be more familiar than I would with current economics textbooks.
Yeah.
Are textbook authors doing a better job of discussing the role of land markets in an economy, and is that significantly an environmentally oriented issue, or are they going back to Ricardian rent and expanding on it to include urban economics?
They're doing a worse job than they used to. For example,
Really?
when I was teaching at Santa Clara University, I used the textbook by Mankiw, and he included a discussion of taxing land. There was even a picture of Henry George, and so I was able to use that in the class. Then a new edition came out later, which removed that, and so he still talks about deadweight loss, but no discussion of the fact that you could tax land without a deadweight loss. And then I actually asked Mankiw why did he remove that. Well, he said he did a survey of professors that used his textbook, which features did they use most, which ones did they use least, and most of them kind of ignored that section that he talked about Henry George and the tax on land value. So since it had little support among the actual instructors, he took it out. I think he should have kept it in, even if it wasn't that widely paid attention to, as something that the students could at least look at. So I think, yeah, things have gotten worse. And then textbook I'm using at San Jose State University doesn't even mention it at all. But of course, I supplement it with my own materials.
Well, what could we do as people who embrace the principles that were embraced by Henry George to be more effective in an educational realm? What perhaps would you recommend to the folks at the Henry George School of Social Science that we examine and consider, incorporating into our educational program that might move the needle just a little bit, if possible, in the right direction?
I think the needle has to be moved first in scholarly economics, in the academic journals, and then graduate students would read that, and if they became convinced, then they would then start teaching it and writing economics textbooks. The current economic textbooks, it's pretty hopeless because they want a lot of sales. And what sells is conventional economics. If they put in odd stuff, they're afraid it would reduce the adoption of the book by professors.
I see.
I think we have to go to the graduate school and get changes there before we go to the textbook. And it'd be nice if the Henry George School or Schachenbach Foundation or the Lincoln Institute, if we encourage graduate students who are already interested in land to make it a major part of their studies and go on to write about it and teach it, I think this is what the Austrian organizations do. They support graduate students and indoctrinate them into Austrian economics, and then they go on and become influential.
Well, that's certainly one way that should have been undertaken decades ago.
Yeah.
A couple generations ago, certainly when the movement had considerable financial resources coming from people like John C. Lincoln, or even before him from Joseph Fels. But unfortunately, that never really occurred or found any deep level of support, or perhaps you would have many more colleagues who shared your views on economic theory and policy. Um, so we'll have to just keep that in mind, and hopefully the younger generation coming up, can pick up where we're leaving off at some point. Before I let you go, uh, let me ask you a couple more things about the paper that you've written. I mean, I'm really, in my mind, the most difficult public policy issue we face from a standpoint of rational solution is the cost of medical care, including the cost of necessary drugs that people need. I mean, I don't know how a private sector medical system can really provide the level of care at affordable costs unless we make dramatic changes to the system. And you've treated that just briefly, but I'd like to ask you to expand on your basic ideas of what would work to bring the cost down and to be able to expand medical care to those who today are least able to acquire it.
Yeah, I think a major reform that needs to happen is to delink medical services from employment. Because half the people get their medical services from their employer, if you lose your job, you lose your medical services. And if you had a previous condition, then you've got no care. And what I suggested is to make medical services, including insurance, taxable income, the same as money income, but then make medical expenses tax deductible. And see, the reason people get medical services from their employer is due to the income tax. The medical services and insurance are tax-free income. So of course that's where things are kept. If it wasn't tax-free, then individuals could then buy their own insurance. And the second reform is to, insurance is regulated by the state governments. So if you make it a more of a national system, where I in California, if I want to, can buy insurance from a company in New York or Connecticut, then there could be more competition. And then, of course, you need legal reforms. I don't know how serious this is, but a lot of doctors have to spend a lot of money on malpractice insurance and make unnecessary tests just to avoid lawsuits. So some kind of legal reform that would reduce the cost of litigation for doctors would also help reduce costs. That's a cost that other countries don't have, that the United States has. And then to make medical costs more affordable, a higher earned income tax credit, right, would then enable low-income people to better afford medical care as well as other things.
Would you equate that with a negative income tax for low-income individuals?
Yeah. It's like it's just very much like a negative income tax. If your income is very low and you don't pay income tax at all, you actually get money from the government. And so I think that's a good approach. And instead of minimum wages, if we had a higher earned income tax credit, you could eliminate some of the problems of poverty that we have now. Of course, the more fundamental reform is to eliminate taxes on wages and replace them with taxes on land value, but that would be the radical reform which we can't get at present.
Yeah. I've made the argument, not with much success, I might say, that since we have such a difficult time collecting rents directly, the challenge in our property tax system is, in order to collect anything close to the full potential rental value of a location, you have to convince 3 or 4 different levels of tax collection to change the property tax to a land tax. Yeah. You've got the township, the county, the borough, the city, the town, and the school district all collecting revenue from property taxes, and they all have their own rate system. That's right. With that kind of difficulty, it has seemed to me that our best chance of collecting the greatest amount of rent unearned to individuals or to entities is by a uh, a movement to a truly progressive but highly simplified income tax. And my thought was, well, why don't we start? Let's get rid of as much complexity as we can by eliminating all deductions and exemptions except one, and that would be for a level of exempt income. And it could be significant. For example, let's say 100% of the national median income for every individual would be exempt from taxation. And then above that amount, you would subject income to an increasing rate of taxation on higher ranges of income, which as you get higher and higher up in income, most, not all of course, but most of the income that would be subject to the higher rates of taxation would be rent derived. And it seems to me that that might be the one politically feasible way to capture rents without significantly impacting economic output and production.
Yeah, that would be certainly a great improvement, and I would add to that charitable donations should be deductible.
Should not be deductible.
Should be deductible. That's the one deduction I think that would be good, because let's say your tax rate is 50%, then in order to give to charity $100, you have to earn 200, because 100 would be taxed, and then you'd have 100 to give to charity. If the charitable donation were tax deductible, then you'd only have to earn $100 to give away $100.
Well, that's a point we could discuss at a future conference venue, Fred. Just think about it. Let's say if the median income right now is maybe 58,000. Yeah. So a household with two adult incomes earning the median exempt amount, they would have a household income of $116,000 that would be tax exempt.
Yes.
So to them, making a charitable contribution would they might not get a tax deduction for it, but it would be inconsequential to them in terms of disposable income.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So I think that those are fine points that could be discussed and worked out. But I'm optimistic that you've responded positively, that you at least think the idea of attacking rents through the income tax, could be economically a sound policy to take.
That's right. But the income tax would tax explicit rental income, as a landlord gets income from a tenant, but it would not be taxing the implicit rent that owner-occupied people get from their housing.
Yeah, and that's a whole different proposal that I've read that too from different economists, arguing the fact that we as homeowners enjoy a unearned income from our property. Since we live in it, we don't have to pay rent to ourselves.
Yeah, and there are actually countries that do tax that as income.
Well, let me give you the last word in this conversation. Are there any issues that we haven't discussed that you think are, important enough that you'd like to make a few comments before we close our conversation?
I just want to close by hoping that if people who consider themselves progressive would have a deeper understanding of the causes of problems of poverty, inequality, and so on, then they'd be open to permanent remedies instead of simply treating the effects. So that's what I hope to accomplish with this Economics for Progressives. And so maybe if what I've written can circulate, or if the Henry George School would like to have a session on that, I think this would be this fall, when everybody's paying attention to politics, would be a great opportunity to have these kinds of discussions.
Great. Well, I don't know if you've considered video recording any of your classroom lectures, but is that a possibility that you might put something out on YouTube, that some of your classroom discussion so that people could see and listen to a more in-depth exchange?
Well, I've made a few videos actually, and so I think the best thing would be a video focused on this, teaching the basic principles. Because in classes, I'm following a textbook and, do a little more. Not quite
Okay.
effective.
Well, with that, I thank you very much for giving us the time and spending with me. I've certainly learned a lot from our exchange, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure the viewers and those who get to see the video will appreciate it as well when it's up and available.
Very good. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fred. That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I am Edward Dodson, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.